We've all heard of the Chernobyl disaster, but do we know the names of survivors and first responders? From the chilling first-hand accounts of survivors to the heroic acts of firefighters, these are the dark stories of Chernobyl survivors you've never heard. In the days following the Chernobyl disaster, dozens of lives were lost. But just 10 days later, there was a new threat in the form of potential nuclear steam explosions. There was now a concern about corium, a radioactive lava-like substance mixing with the water in the bubbler pools below. If that happened, it could cause a steam explosion, releasing even more radiation into the area. These explosions could have sent radioactive steam as far as Minsk, about 200 miles away. So to prevent this, the decision was made to drain the pools by opening the sluice gates. The problem was that these gates were controlled by valves located in a flooded underground annex next to Reactor 4. The path to the valves had been cleared, but the water was still knee-deep in some areas, thanks to firefighters who had used specialized hoses to make it passable. 3 men volunteered for the task: Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bezpolov, and Boris Boranov. Nobody thought they were going to survive, including these 3 who figured that they would die from radiation exposure, but they went ahead anyway, ready and willing to give up their lives in order to save hundreds of thousands of others. And miraculously, they succeeded, preventing an even worse disaster. Alexei Ananenko is still alive, now living in Kiev, as well as Valery Bezpolov. Unfortunately, Boris Boranov is no longer with us, but he survived 20 years after the mission, passing away in 2005 at the age of 64. All 3 have since been awarded the title Hero of Ukraine. This is Vasily Ignatenko. He was a Soviet firefighter, one of the first on the scene after the Chernobyl explosion in 1986. On that night, he and his team were called in to put out fires at the power plant, which had been caused by the debris from the exploded reactor. Ignatenko and his crew climbed up to the roof of the building, where they had to fight flames caused by radioactive material. They were dealing with fires, but at the same time, the radiation levels were severe. As they worked, they started feeling the effects of radiation sickness, nausea, weakness, and vomiting. The water system had been damaged in the blast, so they had to use hoses from a fire escape to put out the fires, but it wasn't enough to protect them from the radiation. Eventually, they couldn't keep going. Ignatenko and the others were helped down from the roof and rushed to the hospital. He was later transferred to Moscow, where doctors tried a bone marrow transplant, but it didn't work. His body just kept deteriorating. By May 13th, just a couple weeks after the disaster, Ignatenko passed away from the effects of radiation poisoning. It only makes sense to talk about Vasily's wife, Lyudmila Ignatenko, as well. She stayed by his side until his death, knowing full well that she could be exposed to harmful radiation too. After the explosion, Lyudmila traveled with Vasily's father to Moscow, where he was being treated for severe radiation poisoning. Even though his condition was rapidly worsening, she stayed at the hospital, caring for him as he deteriorated. Vasily's health declined quickly, and it was Lyudmila who called their family to Moscow when he was near death. On the night of April 26, 1986, Alexander Yevchenko was on a night shift at Chernobyl's reactor number 4, expecting a quiet shift after the reactor had been powered down for a safety test. But around 1:23 a.m., a massive explosion shook the plant. "The doors of my office were blown out," he said, describing this violent rush of dust and steam. In the chaos, debris fell around them as the lights went out. Alexander and a colleague ran to the transport corridor to find shelter, having no idea what had just happened. They thought maybe something heavy had fallen or even that war had broken out, but soon they realized that the reactor had exploded. After trying to call the control room with no luck, Alexander was ordered to bring stretchers. When he reached the control room, he met a colleague who was so severely burned he was almost totally unrecognizable. The man told him to go to the explosion site where others were injured, and it was completely horrific. The water coolant system was destroyed, pipes were hanging, and the reactor hull had been reduced to rubble. Alexander even said he saw a blue light rising from the reactor, a sign of deadly radiation. Knowing he could die from the radiation, he and others still tried to help. He saw workers sent to manually lower the control rods into the reactor, but they never made it back. he was left alone, barely surviving, with radiation sickness setting in. By 5 a.m., he was too weak to walk, and he was rushed to the hospital. Radiation left him with burns, constant transfusions, and long-term health problems, but miraculously, he did manage to survive. The Chernobyl liquidators were thousands of workers, including soldiers, firefighters, and engineers who were sent to contain the disaster. They worked under extreme conditions, cleaning up radioactive debris, building a concrete sarcophagus to encase the reactor, and helped in fighting fires. Unfortunately, a lot of them suffered from severe radiation sickness, cancers, and other long-term health issues, and those were just the ones who survived long enough. Unfortunately, their sacrifices were mostly ignored until much later, too. So, I'm going to show you a handful of surviving Chernobyl liquidators, along with quotes from them reflecting on the work they did in the aftermath of the disaster. This is Kozhevshna Ivanivna. I grew up in an orphanage. My fate was my own. If you are working somewhere, then you are responsible for that place of work. This is Yashin Mikhailovich, who said, "Nobody was obliged to work. I did my job. I wasn't forced to. After the accident, Pripyat was completely cut off from the country. You couldn't send a telegram or call anyone." Pictured here is Shirokov Alexei Vichlovich. "No, I never regretted a thing. Nobody forced us to be there. I was invited to work, and the young lads, I tried to protect them. After a stroke, I can hardly remember my words." Viktor Brukinov was the manager in charge of constructing the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and served as its director until 1986. On the night of the disaster, he was called about an incident at the plant, but he didn't know that there was a test happening at the time. As he passed by reactor 4, he saw the damage and immediately ordered all authorities to meet at the nuclear bunker. Brukinov tried reaching the shift supervisor, but there was no response, so he activated the general radiation accident alarm, notifying the Ministry of Energy. Despite the obvious damage, Brukinov and his team were still trying to manage the situation, unaware that the reactor was already destroyed. Later, when Brukinov went to the courtyard and saw graphite pieces on the ground, he still couldn't believe that the reactor was gone. "This did not fit in my head," he said. In the aftermath, he was questioned about the incident, stating, "I am guilty. As a leader, I did not finish something. Somewhere I showed negligence, indiscretion." He was found guilty of gross safety violations and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He took some accountability, but also did insist that the accident was caused by flawed technology, not just human error. Anatoly Dyatlov was the deputy chief engineer at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and oversaw the operations of reactor 4. On the night of the disaster, Dyatlov was supervising the test that went horribly wrong. Before the test, he ordered the reactor power to be reduced to 200 megawatts, but when the reactor stalled, they couldn't raise it without risking a dangerous situation. But Dyatlov allowed the power to be increased, not fully understanding the risks. Unfortunately, this power increase led to the reactor's explosion, and even after the explosion, Dyatlov was in denial about how severe this really was. He continued ordering actions to restore control, like trying to manually insert control rods, but by then, it was just too late. When radiation sickness set in, he tried to report to his superiors, all while showing symptoms like vomiting from radiation exposure. He spent time in the hospital and suffered hair loss and burns from radiation, but he did survive. He was later blamed for the disaster in court, but he insisted that the reactor's design flaws, not operation error, were to blame. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He later wrote about the flaws in the reactor design, claiming that the accident was, quote, caused by completely inappropriate characteristics of the reactor. He died in 1995 from bone marrow cancer, most likely caused by radiation exposure. Alexander Akimov was the shift supervisor at Chernobyl's reactor 4 during the disaster. Again, when the reactor stalled and they tried to raise power again, it put the reactor in a dangerous state. Akimov ordered the emergency shutdown button to be pressed, but instead of stopping the reactor, it made the situation worse, causing the explosion. After the blast, Akimov and his team stayed in the reactor building trying to pump water into the core, and they continued working even when starting to show signs of radiation sickness. Akimov later said, "Believe what I was hearing about the reactor's damage. It just didn't seem possible." Akimov was exposed to a lethal dose of radiation and was sent to Moscow for treatment. But by the time investigators came to question him, he was too weak to speak. In the end, Akimov died from radiation sickness 2 weeks after after the explosion at just 33 years old. Evgeny Yashin was 40 years old when the Chernobyl disaster hit in April of 1986. He worked as a chemist at the plant, and on that fateful day, he was on a bus heading to work. Recalling the incident in an interview, he said, "Everyone was talking about the explosion of the reactor's emergency cooling system, but passing by the fourth power unit, it became clear to us that it was much more serious than expected. The wall of the reactor had completely fallen out, and a glow could be seen, resembling a steel foundry oven. We took action immediately." End quote. Yashin was in charge of a 300-person team at Chernobyl's chemical workshop, where their main job was to prepare demineralized water and process radioactive waste. "We prepared the water to extinguish the reactor, walked knee-deep in water, and organized pumping. Water appeared to be flowing endlessly. The system was launched at full capacity, and more water was required," he said. On April 27th, Pripyat was evacuated, and Yashin remembers the buses going through the city to pick up residents and staff en route. By early May, staff began suffering serious side effects. Doctors were regularly monitoring their health, and some were even taken out of the zone to rest. Years later, Yashin still feels the effects on his health. For one, he has cancer, and he's gone on to say, "Very few of my colleagues are still alive. I am surprised that I, myself, am still alive." Another man I think is worth mentioning is Igor Kostin. Igor Kostin was one of only 5 photographers to capture images during the disaster. Working for the Novosti press agency in Kiev, he was sent to cover the immediate aftermath of the accident. You may have never heard his name, but you've probably seen his photos. Kostin's aerial images of the plant have become pretty iconic, and at the time, he was showing the true scale of the destruction when the Soviet government was trying to downplay how bad it really was. But Kostin didn't just photograph the immediate aftermath, he also documented the long-term effects, including deformities in animals born in the contaminated area. He made repeated trips into the exclusion zone to document the destruction caused by nuclear radiation. He passed away in 2015 at 78 years old. Abandoned amusement park. It kind of wasn't even abandoned, to be honest. It was set to open just days after the disaster, so it was never actually used. The rusted Ferris wheel and desolate bumper cars still stand though. It's definitely eerie, but somber too, an area frozen in time, a reminder of what could have been. The park, meant to be a source of entertainment for the residents of Pripyat and the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, now stands as a testament to the sudden and irreversible changes brought about by the events of that fateful day. The centerpiece of the park is the rusted Ferris wheel, which was meant to offer a nice panoramic view of the city, and surrounding it are the remains of bumper cars, a once colorful carousel, and the other amusement rides, all now deteriorating and covered in a layer of rust. And instead of the screams of happy visitors, there's just an eerie silence. Empty benches and picnic tables where families were meant to gather, completely desolate. Nature slowly reclaiming its territory has overgrown pathways and cracked the pavement, creating this sad, kind of post-apocalyptic ambience. If you are enjoying our channel, by the way, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We got videos coming at you on the daily. Number 9, the reactor control room. So deep within the bowels of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the reactor 4 control room still stands, a relic frozen in time. This once bustling control center was the nerve center where decisions and actions were taken on that night in 1986. It's said that as you step into the room, the air is heavy. The dust-covered dials and cracked screens are a reminder of the frantic attempts to bring the situation under control. The red radiation warning lights, frozen at levels that spell out the magnitude of the disaster. In the dim light, you can almost imagine the hum of machinery, the hurried footsteps, the urgent conversations that once filled the room, a complete contrast to the lifeless, ghostly atmosphere that it has now. Pripyat Hospital. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why the place is unsettling. Hospitals are depressing, even when fully open and operational. Abandoned hospitals are that, Plus they have the creep factor of being empty and abandoned. So an abandoned hospital in the middle of a radioactive death zone, that's pretty much the apex of nightmarish hospitals right there. Looking at images of this place online, it looks like the real life Silent Hill or something. Chipped paint, rusted beds, the building is literally falling apart and decaying. Really oozes with ambience, just not the kind of ambience you want to sit back and relax in. And at number 7, we have the Blackbird of Chernobyl. In the months preceding the catastrophic events of April 26, 1986, residents near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant reported encountering a grotesque creature, a mutated figure with gigantic wings and deep red eyes. Nightmares and direct confrontations with this winged anomaly, later dubbed the Blackbird of Chernobyl, haunted a number of residents of the area. And then there was the devastating explosion of Reactor 4 at 1:23 a.m. The ensuing fire and nuclear meltdown led to the evacuation of over 336,000 people, and the story goes that several survivors of this incident were counted witnessing a colossal blackbird with a 20-foot wingspan soaring through the sky. Even if you've never heard of this particular part of the Chernobyl lore, this story probably sounds kind of familiar. It's very similar to the Mothman sightings in West Virginia right before the Silver Bridge collapse in 1968. The physical description of the creature is similar, and the fact that these creatures were reported appearing right before disasters, both the Blackbird of Chernobyl and the Mothman vanished after each of these catastrophes. So you can't help but wonder if these ominous creatures are bound to disaster, omens that materialize in the shadows preceding total destruction. Next on the list is the notorious Red Forest. So the Red Forest, named for the eerie reddish color assumed by the pine trees following the radioactive fallout, is a symbol of the environmental impact of the Chernobyl disaster. This dense woodland located near the nuclear power plant absorbed a significant amount of radioactive particles, resulting in the death of its vibrant flora. As you step into the Red Forest, the silence is apparently palpable. The once lush trees, now lifeless and devoid of foliage, stand as a testament to the irreversible consequences of the nuclear fallout. Scientists did this really interesting experiment here too, to see how messed up things really were. They filled bags with leaves from clean spots and left them in both normal and messed up areas. So surprise, surprise, leaves in the messed up spots didn't break down much, holding on to about 60% of their weight. This means the radiation messed with the nature's ability to decompose and replenish itself in the area. The leaves stayed dry and intact for almost a year. Sounds harmless, but dry leaves in a place that's prone to forest fires, it's a ticking time bomb. If a fire breaks out, it could spread radioactive stuff beyond the no-go zone. So not only is the radiation messing with the forest's ability to bounce back, but now there's a legit risk of radioactive fire spreading trouble even farther. And at our number 5 spot, we have the piles of gas masks. So famously, there's one specific room in one of the schools in Pripyat where the floor is filled with gas masks. Looters had come in and taken the small amounts of silver in the mask filters. The presence of gas masks is obviously not a good sign. Doesn't make for a very happy sight. Looks more like the apocalypse hit, which is probably what it felt like for the residents of the city that day, especially the youngsters. They must have been scared out of their minds. What's also odd is that these gas masks weren't used. You'd think they would have been. Apparently just a week before the incident, students were trained on how to use them in case of an emergency, but after the incident took place and everyone was being evacuated, people were instructed not to use the masks because the Communist Party leadership thought the use of them would cause people to panic. Basically, they wanted to save face and not blow the issue out of proportion. You know, the worst nuclear disaster in history. Next up, we have the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone sign. This sign is straightforward yet crucial. Placed in the boundaries of the zone, it's a worn out marker, weathered by time, warning anyone who approaches. The sign features the distinct trefoil radiation symbol, an unmistakable sign of the danger that lies beyond, marking the edge between safety and risk. The sign is surrounded by rusted gates and crumbling walls, signifying the transition from the familiar to the forbidden, signaling the presence of invisible threats from the nuclear catastrophe that took place back in '86. The Exclusion Zone sign is a tangible reminder that the invisible dangers of radiation are still very much present. It marks a boundary that, if crossed without caution, could lead to exposure to radioactive contaminants. It's a no-nonsense marker in a place where the consequences of nuclear disaster are still very real, but people jump over all the time, apparently, like graffiti and stuff inside the area. That I wouldn't do it personally, but hey, live your lives. Next on the list are the Chernobyl Pripyat river boats, eerie as hell. So these boats were once the lifeblood of Pripyat, but when the reactor went kaboom in '86, everything changed. The whole area got evacuated, leaving these boats stranded and forgotten. Rusted metal, broken windows, and a thick layer of dust. These boats haven't moved in decades, just sitting there like ghost ships on a stagnant river. Nature's creeping in, moss, weeds, and who knows what else. The radiation factor amps up the creepiness. These boats were exposed to the fallout, soaking it up like a sponge. No creaking of the boat against the dock, no hum of engines, just eerie stillness. Then there's the knowledge that Pripyat was a lively place once. Families lived there, kids played by the river. Now it's just a desolate wasteland. Number 2, the dolls. Within a deserted kindergarten of Pripyat, the floor is scattered with the haunting remnants of childhood abandoned dolls left behind by evacuated youngsters. Their lifeless eyes stare into the emptiness of a room that once echoed with laughter and play. The dolls, which are now weathered and disheveled, sit frozen in time. Some left in the exact same places where they were left in the middle of play all those years back. And what makes the presence of these dolls so somber is that the residents were told that the evacuation was going to be temporary. So in this abrupt evacuation, children left these toys behind thinking they'd be back soon to get them. But of course, as we all know, they never returned. One of the saddest displays is a set of 4 dolls positioned for a tea party, left sitting in place ever since that fateful day in '86. And we gotta finish things off with all the icky animal mutations. Now, this is actually true. This is not in the realm of cryptozoology. There have been animals found within the area that have some unusual mutations. You have rodents with peculiar physical deformities, ranging from extra limbs to abnormal growths. In some cases, the effects extend to changes in the color of their fur. Birds have also shown signs of the radiation's influence. Some have beak malformations, and even their mating practices have been shown to be off. And you can only imagine how messed up some of the fish are in the Pripyat River. Fish have abnormalities like altered spinal structures and asymmetrical body growth because they're living in radioactive water. What's kind of interesting though is that, sure, there are a bunch of mutations, but the Exclusion Zone has kind of become a haven for some wildlife because there's no human interference, or at least very, very little. So some species have thrived in this absence of human activity. Nature is incredibly resilient.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have the two-headed calf. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, the Exclusion Zone became a breeding ground for some of the most bizarre and terrifying animal mutations in history. One of the most unsettling discoveries was the birth of a two-headed calf. Farmers near Chernobyl were stunned when they witnessed an animal with not one, but 2 fully formed heads and underdeveloped limbs, a grotesque reminder of the disaster's enduring legacy. Scientists immediately linked this horrifying mutation to the intense radiation that not only killed life in the area, but also twisted the very DNA of surviving species. As the impact of radiation altered the fetal development of these animals, this calf's survival became a tragic symbol of how nature was forced to adapt in the face of devastation. Over time, chilling photos of the two two-headed calf circulated, serving as a haunting visual of the unseen toll the disaster took on the natural world, forever etching this mutation into Chernobyl's dark and twisted history. The disturbing sight of this calf is just one of the many strange and horrifying mutations found in the zone, proof that Chernobyl's legacy is still alive in the most startling and unnerving ways. Next, we are talking about the glowing spiders. Deep in the eerie forests of Chernobyl, something straight out of a horror movie is happening. Spiders, those creepy creatures we're already wary of, started crafting glowing webs in the radioactive wastelands. But this isn't just some freakish mutation, it's an odd twist of nature's ability to adapt. The radioactive particles creeping through the area have infiltrated these arachnids, altering the very makeup of their silk and causing it to glow under UV light like a neon sign of doom. It's both chilling and amazing at the same time, a very bizarre, fluorescent testament to how radiation doesn't just destroy, it rewires every part of the environment. Despite the terrifying look of these glowing webs, the spiders seem to be thriving, proving once again that life in Chernobyl might be twisted beyond recognition, but it's certainly not backing down. Next, we are talking about the gigantic catfish of the Pripyat River. No one cruising along the Pripyat River expects to come face to face with freshwater behemoths that could dwarf a grown adult, but that's exactly what lurks beneath these murky waters. Catfish measuring a jaw-dropping 9 feet or more have become a bizarre local legend, their enormous shadows drifting beneath the submerged ruins of old docks and tangled reeds. The strange truth is that these giants aren't sporting visible mutations like extra fins or gnarled faces. What's unsettling is the sheer scale of their growth. Without normal predators around, and with radioactive contaminants subtly affecting their environment, these fish have been free to balloon to unbelievable proportions. They've essentially taken full advantage of their strange new world, transforming from ordinary river dwellers into something that feels more at home in a monster movie. Such extremes of size raise uneasy questions about what the radiation may be doing to the entire food chain and how nature warps when left to wander uncharted territory. Next, we are talking about the albino moose. Nothing quite rattles the senses like catching a glimpse of a massive snow-white moose quietly stepping through the abandoned woodlands around Chernobyl. With their unusual earthy browns seemingly washed out, these pale giants cut ghostly silhouettes against broken fences and crumbling buildings. Scientists believe this unnatural albinism is directly tied to radiation tinkering with the genes that produce skin and fur pigment. What makes these eerie creatures so unsettling is how easily they blend into the Fallout's strange new normal. Towering figures that have adapted to become haunting, colorless symbols of the region's invisible scars. Each measured step through the underbrush feels like a chilling reminder that even the toughest inhabitants of this land have been reshaped in ways that defy both logic and expectation. Next, we are talking about the birds with deformed beaks. There is something deeply unsettling about watching a tiny swallow struggle to pick up the simplest seed because its beak curves at an impossible angle. In Chernobyl's exclusion zone, researchers have reported sparrows and swallows sporting twisted, elongated beaks that look more like poorly bent wire than a sleek feeding tool. These deformities aren't just cosmetic, they can make it nearly impossible for birds to gather enough food, threatening their chances of survival. Scientists link these bizarre changes to genetic damages from lingering radiation, the same invisible force that's quietly reshaping the area's entire ecosystem. These deformed beaks aren't just a tragedy for the birds themselves, but a glaring symbol of how nature, when exposed to something as catastrophic as nuclear fallout, veers down a path it's not supposed to follow. Next, we are talking about the black frogs. Out of all the strange and eerie changes in Chernobyl's exclusion zone, the sighting of pitch black frogs might be one of the most unsettling. Eastern tree frogs, once a vibrant green, now sport deep inky black skin, blending into the desolate landscape like shadows. This isn't just a freak accident, instead it's an eerie form of adaptation. Scientists believe that these frogs' dark skin acts as a natural shield, protecting them from the radiation still lingering in the soil and the air. By absorbing less harmful energy, their blackened color may give them a surprising survival edge in this nuclear-scarred environment. But while this adaptation could be seen as a victory for biology, it's also a reminder of just how deeply the forces of nature can alter life when pushed to the brink brink, forcing creatures to evolve in ways we can barely comprehend. In our number 4 spot today, we have the wolves with strange fur patterns. There's something jarring about locking eyes with a wolf whose coat looks as if it's been crudely repainted by nature's own shaky hand. Within Chernobyl's silent forests, some wolves now sport baffling fur patterns, patches that never grew back, odd stripes where there should be solid gray, and splotches of color that defy any recognizable pattern. Scientists suspect that these peculiar coats hint at deeper, invisible changes within their DNA, possibly caused by the relentless radiation that seeped into every inch of their environment. What's truly surprising, though, is that the wolves aren't just surviving. They're actually thriving. In a world abandoned by humans, they've staked their claim as top predators, hunting in small packs and darting through ruined buildings like ghosts. Next, we are talking about the mutated wild boars. It's one thing to stumble across a wild boar in the forest, but discovering one with bizarrely shortened legs, an overgrown head, and tusks twisting at unnatural angles is another level entirely. In Chernobyl's exclusion zone, these heavy-set animals have soaked up a cocktail of radioactive isotopes, contaminating their bodies and warping their development in startling ways. Some boars appear top-heavy and clumsy, as if their own skeletons are struggling to keep pace with the genetic mischief unleashed by the fallout. While not every individual shows such blatant distortions, enough of them do to leave an unsettling impression. These creatures are shaped by an environment that continues to bend the rules. Each gnarled tusk and awkward limb stands as a living reminder that radiation does not fade quietly. It leaves its fingerprint on every generation that must somehow learn to survive in its shadow. Next, we are talking about the insects without wings. It's hard to wrap your head around a butterfly that can't take flight, yet that's exactly what researchers are finding in Chernobyl's exclusion zone. Delicate creatures like butterflies and moths, once symbols of gentle transformation, now struggle with stunted wings that look half-grown or never form at all. Instead of fluttering gracefully over the tangled fields, some are left crawling on the ground, vulnerable and off balance. Scientists believe the radiation's relentless tinkering with genetic material disrupts critical stages of growth, leaving wings twisted or completely absent. It's an unsettling sight that strips these insects of their most defining feature. And finally, ending off this list today, we are talking about Przewalski's horse. These horses first originated in Mongolia and were wild horses that became endangered. They first became endangered due to hunters who would often kill the stallion, which of course would provide many difficulties in terms of reproduction. These horses also weren't doing very well in captivity, which made things even more difficult. This, combined with the harsh winters which would often claim their lives, left things looking quite grim for the species. In the late 1990s, however, in an effort to help repopulate these animals, 30 of them were released into the Ukrainian side of the exclusion zone, and it is believed that some of these original horses are actually still alive today, which is amazing, but camera trap images have also shown young horses and foals, which means they are repopulating, which is a huge win. They're expanding population in such a harsh environment, which could mean that they might potentially be able to return from the brink and go on to continue as a species, which is something we always want to see.
The elephant's foot is one of the most disturbing remnants of the Chernobyl disaster. It's a large mass of graphite and concrete that formed underneath reactor number 4 after the explosion. When the reactor melted down, the materials that were inside started to mix and solidify, creating this massive, oddly shaped toxic lump. It got its name because from a distance it kind of looks like an elephant's foot with large bulbous structures sticking out. The problem with this thing was that it emitted terrifying amounts of radiation right after the explosion. In fact, at the time it was one of the most radioactive spots on planet Earth. People working to clean it up or get closer to it received lethal doses of radiation just by being near. In the years following the disaster, it became clear that the elephant's foot wasn't just dangerous for people who were close by though, it also had an ongoing impact on the environment. The radiation affected the soil, air, and water, and it made cleanup operations even more difficult. For decades, scientists have been worried about how much more radiation might still be leaking from it. One of the most disturbing medical effects from the Chernobyl disaster is a condition known as the Chernobyl heart. It's a congenital heart defect that's been found in people born after the disaster. disaster, and it's believed to be caused by the radiation exposure that their mothers experienced while pregnant. The condition causes the heart to develop abnormally, which of course causes a long list of problems, including heart failure, and unfortunately the number of youngsters born with this condition is believed to be much higher than originally reported, and the full extent of it is still not fully understood. A lot of them were born to parents who were exposed to radiation during the aftermath of the explosion, but it wasn't just the immediate survivors of the disaster that were affected, it's also the generations that followed, and it's not just the heart that's impacted either. Other birth defects, cancers, developmental issues, all been linked to the radiation, and some scientists worry that this is just the tip of the iceberg. The death zone around Chernobyl, also known as the Exclusion Zone, is a 30-kilometer radius surrounding the site of the explosion. After the disaster, the area was deemed uninhabitable because of the extremely high levels of radiation. People living within this zone were evacuated, and the area has remained largely off limits ever since. Even today, it's not entirely safe to enter the zone. Some parts have been deemed safe enough for tourists to visit, but there are still areas where radiation levels are high enough to cause serious health risks. One of the most unsettling things about the death zone is how nature has taken over. Wildlife has returned to the area, and some species like wolves and wild boar are surviving in a landscape that was once populated by humans. And while on one hand nature is healing itself, scientists are concerned about how the radiation might affect these animals over time. More on that in a bit. The death zone is this eerie place though, where time seems to have stopped, but the dangers lurking there are very real. Even though the exclusion zone is mostly off limits, the real fear is all the hidden hotspots of radiation, areas where radiation levels are significantly higher than the surrounding environment. They can be found in random places like under trees, in buildings, or in the soil, and they're incredibly difficult to detect without specialized equipment. Some of these hotspots have been measured at radiation levels so high that a person spending even a short time in the area would receive a deadly dose. The worrying part about these hotspots is that we don't know exactly how widespread they are either. Even scientists studying the area have been caught off guard by these invisible pockets of radiation. In some cases, the radiation is buried deep underground, and it's nearly impossible to predict where it might show up next. In the long term, these hotspots could cause serious health issues for anyone who ventures into the area, even if avoiding the exclusion zone. See, one of the scariest things about radiation is that it's invisible. You can't see it, smell it, or taste it, and it can seep into the environment in ways that are hard to track. When the Chernobyl reactor exploded, radiation was released into the atmosphere and spread over large areas of Europe. While we know that radiation has a very real dangerous effect on human health, the real fear is how it can stay hidden in the environment. It's in the soil, the water, even the air, and you might not even know you're being exposed to it until it's too late. Today, certain crops in areas surrounding the exclusion zone still have radioactive traces, and scientists worry that it could affect the food supply for generations. It's not just the immediate aftermath of the explosion that's dangerous, it's the long-term, ongoing exposure to low-level radiation that's still having an impact. And the health consequences of radiation exposure might not show up until years down the road. The liquidators were thousands of workers, soldiers, and volunteers who were sent in to help clean up the Chernobyl disaster in the weeks and months following the explosion. They were tasked with containing the radiation, decontaminating the area, and preventing further damage. These people were exposed to high levels of radiation, and the effects were devastating. Some developed cancer, others suffered from organ damage, and a lot of them died in the years following the disaster. They were often given little to no protection from the radiation they were being exposed to. They were seen as disposable and sent in without proper safety gear or even adequate training. For years, their exposure to radiation was downplayed or just outright ignored. It wasn't until much later that the real extent of their suffering came to light. It's said that over 100,000 liquidators were exposed to harmful levels of radiation, and in the years since, a lot of them have developed serious health issues. The liquidators' story is definitely one of the darkest parts of the Chernobyl disaster. This is a group of people sent in to clean up a mess that they had no control over, paying the price with their lives. One of the ongoing concerns surrounding Chernobyl is the contamination of water. After the explosion, the reactor's cooling systems failed and large amounts of radioactive water were released into the environment. This water ended up in nearby rivers, lakes, and the groundwater. There's been efforts to clean things up, but the problem is far from solved. Radioactive particles are still found in nearby rivers and lakes. This means that both the environment and people living nearby are still at risk of exposure to radioactive water. The issue with radioactive water is that it can be difficult to track. The contamination can spread silently, affecting big areas of land and water over time. Radioactive particles can linger for decades, slowly working their way into the environment, and as I already discussed, this can and has led to long-term health issues. After the original concrete structure known as the sarcophagus started to degrade, a newer, larger sarcophagus was built around the Chernobyl reactor. The goal was to contain the radiation and prevent it from spreading further. The new safe confinement, as it's called, is this huge structure designed to last for at least 100 years. Now, while it is a major improvement over the original sarcophagus, there are still some concerns. First of all, it's only designed to last a century, and we have no real idea of what will happen to the thing once it starts to deteriorate. If it fails, the consequences could be catastrophic. The new safe confinement is designed to keep radiation contained, but there's always a possibility of something going wrong. For example, if the structure were to collapse or crack, there's a risk of radiation leaking into the environment. The idea that we have to rely on this temporary fix for such a long-term problem is a bit unsettling. The wildlife around Chernobyl has actually been doing pretty well since humans have left, but there's a pretty disturbing side to that. A lot of the animals are showing signs of mutations. Some are born with extra limbs, messed up faces, problems with their organs. Now, it's not like genetic mutations never happen in nature, but the fact that these kinds of mutations are more common in Chernobyl than in any other place is pretty telling. Scientists think radiation has a big part in these changes, and they're worried that over time this could cause some species to completely die off. Some mutations are small and hard to notice, but others are much more obvious, like animals with tumors, extra or missing body parts, or just high levels of radiation detected in their bodies. Some animals are still managing to survive quite well, though. It's just tough to say how all these mutations will affect their populations long term. But the idea that radiation might have changed the very genetic makeup of entire species in the area is a pretty scary thought. Finally, there are the phantom radio signals. These are mysterious, unexplained radio transmissions that people exploring the exclusion zone have reported hearing. The strange thing is, these signals often come through on frequencies that should be totally silent or unused. Urban explorers with radios have said they've picked up distorted voices or odd sounds that don't sound like your typical radio noise. Some even claim they've heard vague messages coming through. One theory is that this could be some kind of lingering electromagnetic effect from the nuclear disaster, but those who lean towards more paranormal stuff say the signals might be coming from the spirits of people who died during the disaster, trying to reach out through the radio.
Today we have the forest fires. The Chernobyl exclusion zone has witnessed several forest fires over the years, which have raised significant environmental and health concerns. These fires are particularly problematic because they can remobilize radioactive elements like cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium, which were deposited in the area following the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. When the vegetation in the exclusion zone contaminated by these radioactive particles burns, the smoke and ash can carry these particles over long distances, potentially spreading radiation beyond the immediate area of the fire. This phenomenon poses a considerable challenge for both environmental management and for public health. From an ecological standpoint, the redistribution of radioactive materials can affect a wide range of organisms, altering the mutation rates and impacting the health and stability of ecosystems in and around the exclusion zone. For human populations, especially those living in proximity to the exclusion zone, there is a risk of exposure to radioactive particles carried by smoke, which can have long-term health implications. The management of these fires, therefore, is not just a matter of controlling the blaze, but also involves monitoring and mitigating the spread of radioactivity, making it a very complex task for both firefighters and radiation safety experts. Next up, we have the new nuclear reactions. It's what nobody wants to hear in relation to Chernobyl. New nuclear reactions. Can't be good. The recent detection of increasing fission reactions in an inaccessible chamber of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant has raised significant concerns among scientists and safety experts. This chamber, which has remained sealed and unobserved by human or robotic means since the 1986 disaster, has shown a worrying surge in neutron emissions, a clear indicator of escalating nuclear fission activity. The primary concern for researchers is to figure out whether this escalation in nuclear activity will naturally diminish, or it will require a complex and hazardous intervention to avert a potential secondary nuclear incident. The situation is kind of similar to smoldering embers in a barbecue pit, a metaphor illustrating that while it doesn't pose an immediate explosive threat, it is an active problem that definitely requires ongoing supervision. The implications of this development are terrifying, as it highlights the long-term complexities and unpredictable nature of nuclear disaster aftermaths. This just goes to show how the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster continues to teach us and captivate us even decades later. Speaking of how Chernobyl continues to teach us more about the effects of nuclear disaster and radioactivity, next up on our list we have the radiation research. Ongoing research in the Chernobyl exclusion zone has significantly advanced our understanding of radiation's long-term ecological and biological impacts. Scientists have been studying the mutation rates in various species of flora and fauna within the zone, providing data on how radiation affects living organisms at the genetic level. These mutations, ranging from subtle genetic changes to visible deformities, offers insight into the mechanisms of radiation-induced damage. Researchers are also exploring how these genetic changes might affect population dynamics, species interactions, and overall ecosystem health. The area has become a unique natural laboratory for studying the ecological impacts of radiation, allowing scientists to observe the recovery processes in ecosystems subjected to high radiation levels. This research not only sheds light on the resilience and adaptability of nature, but also informs future strategies for managing contaminated environments and assessing the environmental risks associated with nuclear accidents. Next up, we have the very unfortunate psychological impacts of the disaster. Psychology issues resulting from widespread fear of radiological disease is a much greater issue, impacting many more people with lethal health effects. People who believe they or others have been impacted by radiological illnesses, erroneous or otherwise, exhibit greater issues with feelings of no control or fatalistic and pessimistic outlooks. This often leads to harmful behaviors, such as a lack of initiative to treat diseases. These fears are further strengthened by poor public understanding of the effects of radiation. Because of the radiation in Chernobyl, the people living there had to move, and it's been studied that these groups of people believed they had an illness related to radiation exposure more often than the citizens who actually remained inside of the contaminated regions. This brings into question the effectiveness of resettlement. Also, psychological distresses can significantly increase cancer mortality rates, possibly as much as 97%, nearly double, resulting in as many as approximately 100,000 additional cancer mortalities. From this accident, the fear of radiological illness has been way more prominent. Around our halfway mark today, we have the decaying of nature. Since the Chernobyl disaster, scientists have realized something very strange with the plants in the exclusion zone. They have realized that the dead trees, plants, and leaves at the contaminated site don't decay at nearly the same rate as plants elsewhere. This is definitely weird. I mean, just thinking about it, I would have thought that the opposite would be true, that plants in the exclusion zone would decay even faster, but this is why it's good that I am not a scientist. Tim Mosow, a professor of biology at the University of South Carolina, has said, quote, "We were stepping over all these dead trees on the ground that had been killed by the initial blast. Years later, these tree trunks were in pretty good shape. If a tree had fallen in my backyard, it would be sawdust in 10 years or so." To find out what was happening, or more accurately, what wasn't happening, the research team collected hundreds of samples of leaf litter from forest floors that were not contaminated by radiation and stuffed the leaves into bags lined with pantyhose. This was to keep out insects. They then distributed these bags around the Chernobyl area and waited 9 months. The results were shocking. Samples of leaf litter that were placed in highly contaminated areas showed 40% less decomposition than samples that were placed in uncontaminated sites. The degree of decay was proportional to the degree of radioactive contamination at each site, according to the study. Now that really is just interesting. Next up on our list, we have the Sweden effect. I'm sure you might be wondering what Sweden could possibly have to do with Chernobyl, but don't fret, I'm here to tell you. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl rode the wind over to Sweden and spit out in the form of rain. As teardrops? Somebody's really crying. As raindrops landed, so did radiation, especially in parts of north and central Sweden. Keeping food from getting contaminated was an issue in some places. Northern Sweden absorbed a whole 5% of the radioactive cesium-137 that Chernobyl released into the air. Atoms of it wound up in the lichen that reindeer graze on. That same year, after the farmers' meat harvesting season, it was discovered that almost 80% of the Swedish reindeer meat was too contaminated for sale. 80%! That's so much! Reindeer farmers had to change their practices, harvesting their meat earlier in the year before the animals had a chance to eat the contaminated moss. Because of this contamination, the Swedish authorities actually ended up raising the limit for permissible radiation in game, freshwater fish, wild berries, and mushrooms, based on their view that these foods made up only a little bit of the Swedish diet. Even to this day, a small portion of reindeer can't be sold because they have too much of the radioactive element. Moving on down our list, we have the new safe confinement, also known as the NSC. This structure at Chernobyl represents a monumental advancement in nuclear containment technology. This massive structure, completed and put into place in 2016, was designed to address the critical need to secure the remains of the reactor that was destroyed in the 1986 disaster. The NSC is a feat of engineering, designed to last at least 100 years and to withstand extreme weather conditions. Its primary purpose is to prevent the escape of radioactive material from the original sarcophagus, which was hastily constructed following the accident and had since deteriorated. Additionally, the NSC provides a controlled environment for the deconstruction of the reactor and the management of radioactive waste, effectively reducing the risk of further radiation leakage into the environment, which I think we can all breathe a sigh of relief for. This structure is not only a shield against the radiation, but also serves as a symbol of international cooperation, as its construction involved experts and funding from around the world. The NSC's completion marked a significant step forward in the long-term effort to contain the Chernobyl disaster's legacy and mitigate its environmental impact. Moving on our list, we have the mysterious fungi. Fungi is definitely one of the weirdest things we have on our planet. Not sure if you guys have seen that documentary, Fantastic Fungi, but that thing absolutely blew my mind. It's kind of creepy, but also truly incredible. This isn't just a love letter to mushrooms. I do have a point I'm trying to make here, and that point would be the discovery of radiotrophic fungi in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which presents a remarkable example of life's adaptability to extreme environments. These fungi have developed a unique mechanism to harness radiation for growth. They utilize melanin, a pigment found in their cell walls, to convert gamma radiation into chemical energy. This process is somewhat similar to photosynthesis, where plants use chlorophyll to convert sunlight into energy. We all struggled to say that word in elementary school when we learned about it, but in this case, instead of sunlight, the fungi are using radiation as their energy source. This discovery opens new avenues for research in the fields of biology, ecology, and biotechnology. From a biological standpoint, it provides insights into how organisms adapt to and thrive in hostile environments, which could be crucial for understanding understanding life in extreme conditions on Earth, and potentially other planets too. In terms of practical applications, these radiotrophic fungi could be used in bioremediation to clean up radioactive waste or environments contaminated by nuclear accidents. The fungi are fantastic, what can I say? Next up on our list we have the government cover-up theory. What's a good list without a little government conspiracy, you know what I mean? After the release of the incredible HBO show Chernobyl, which if you haven't seen it, it is a must watch. I'm looking at you, Taylor. Truly such a good show, very unsettling. After the show's release, the Russian government released a statement saying that the show was actually anti-Soviet Union propaganda and that they would be releasing their own Chernobyl show, which would detail how the CIA was actually the cause for the original nuclear disaster. Rumor has it that the CIA sabotaged something which caused the reactor to melt down, and the whole thing was actually America's fault. I have no way of either proving or disproving this theory or legend, but I think it's probably safe to say that someone here isn't telling the truth. I'll let you decide for yourself. And finally, rounding out our list today, we have the alien cleanup. Okay, just one more bizarre theory. There's always gotta be an alien story to keep things interesting and to add to the list of questions we have for extraterrestrials when we hopefully eventually find them. Rather than the aliens causing the disaster, which might be where your mind went, instead this legend suggests that they helped in the aftermath. Apparently, some people out there think that the Chernobyl disaster wasn't as bad as it should have been. I don't think they mean it in as bad of a way as that sounds, but rather that they are surprised that the amount of people who passed in the disaster wasn't higher considering how bad the whole ordeal actually was. This coupled with an apparent eyewitness account from a man named Mikhail Veritsky who claimed he saw a fiery ball of light hovering for a few minutes above the exposed reactor on the night of the incident has led people to speculate that maybe our friendly alien neighbors swooped down in the nick of time to help clean up the mess that was made. Apparently, this ball of light was also seen on September 16th, 1989, when there was more radiation leaking from the unit at Chernobyl, which some claim was the aliens containing the radiation. Honestly, I'd like to think that this one is true, because what a nice thing for the aliens to do. They probably have their own nuclear weapons, so they certainly didn't need ours, and we really did not have the tools to clean it up, so I can definitely appreciate the fact that they were willing to lend a helping hand. Alright? According to a study that began in 1991, the organisms responsible for decomposition and replenishing organic matter back into the ecosystem, such as insects, fungi, and microbes, are presenting symptoms of radioactive contamination, which isn't too shocking, but still isn't good. One of the most prominent areas of this effect has been called the bloody red forest. It's a set of woodland where all the pine trees turned a blood red color right after the meltdown, and then died not long after. Now it's pretty, don't get me wrong, but it's completely unnatural and has caused some issues. Now 15 to 20 years after they were exposed to radiation and died, these trees were not decaying, when at this point normal trees would be long gone. Due to this, scientists decided to run some tests by filling specially prepared garbage bags with leaf litter from uncontaminated areas, making sure there were no insects or decomposers present, and then leaving the bags out in both contaminated and uncontaminated wooded areas in the exclusion zone for nearly a year to check the decomposition rates of the leaves. Now, bags left in uncontaminated areas were as expected, with normal rates of decomposition between 70 to 90% of the leaves decomposing. But the leaves in contaminated areas retained 60% of their original weight, indicating much less activity by natural decomposers. Now, this suggests that the radiation exposure has a detrimental effect on the ability of the Chernobyl ecosystem to replenish itself with nutrients, which could be causing the stunting of tree growth that has been recorded. But with this comes another problem. The leaves in contaminated areas stayed intact and dry even after almost a year, and this could present a fire hazard, which in turn presents a danger of radioactive contaminants being spread outside the exclusion zone by forest fires. So that is scary and just not good at all. Then there's how this affected all the animals. According to a 2011 study in Biological Conservation, Chernobyl caused genetic mutations in plants and animals, increasing
increased by a factor of 20. Among breeding birds in that region, rare species suffer disproportionate effects from the explosion's radiation compared to common species. Now, further research is needed to understand how the increased mutations affect species' reproductive rates, population size, genetic diversity, and other survival factors, but it definitely affected animals in a negative way. In 2016, a study found that the eastern tree frogs in the Chernobyl exclusion zone exhibited different characteristics than their neighboring cousins, and in 2023, another study discovered distinct genetic differences between Chernobyl dogs and dogs living only 10 miles away in Chernobyl City. Now, not all the animals living around Chernobyl are entirely wild, as there are around 900 stray dogs, mostly descended from those left behind when people evacuated the area. Veterinarians, radiation experts, and volunteers from a group called the Dogs of Chernobyl captured the dogs, vaccinated them against diseases, and tagged them. Now, in addition to the tags, some dogs are fitted with radiation detector collars. Now, the dogs offer a way to map radiation across the Chernobyl exclusion zone and study the ongoing effects of the accident. While scientists generally can't get a close look at individual wild animals in the zone, they can monitor the dogs closely, and they are, of course, radioactive. Visitors to the area are advised to avoid petting the dogs to minimize radiation exposure, no matter how cute they are. Now, these dogs have increased rates of cataracts because the eyes are the first tissues to show signs of chronic exposure to ionizing radiation. Now, not all is lost on these dogs though, as the unique genetic diversity of these dogs makes them ideal candidates for future studies, seeking to understand the long-term genetic health effects of highly radioactive environments on populations of large mammals, especially in understanding the biological underpinnings of human survival in regions of high and continuous environmental assault, the researchers said. So, I guess that's a plus. Then there's the birds. While there are plenty of them in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, 489 different species to be exact, they are examples of animals that still face problems from radiation exposure. A study of barn swallows from 1991 to 2006 indicated birds in the exclusion zone displayed more abnormalities than birds from a controlled sample, including deformed beaks, albinistic feathers, bent tail feathers, and deformed air sacs. Now, birds in the zone had less reproductive success, and these birds often had smaller brains, malformed sperm, and cataracts, presumably as a result of radiation-related genetic mutations. Now, if you were already scared of spiders, these ones will freak you out even more. The spiders here are radioactive as they build their webs to catch their prey. They add to the dangerous environment of the forest. These webs are not like normal spider webs. In fact, they are woven in abstract ways that suggest genetic mutation is at hand. Now, they're also highly radioactive themselves, making them a danger for any non-radioactive animal to touch. Now, who knew spiders could get 100 times scarier? But that's not the only scary mutated animal there. According to Slate in the early 90s, which was just a few years after the incident, radiation levels in the wild boar that died near Chernobyl were more than 2,000 times what's considered safe. And even today, eating animals from inside the exclusion zone is still pretty hazardous, as a person might be exposed to radiation levels that are dozens of times higher than what's safe. Then in 2016, a video went viral of a catfish swimming around the cooling pond of the Chernobyl power plant. Very few mutations lead to extra large size, explains University of South Carolina radiation specialist Dr. Timothy Masu. Instead, they grow less efficiently, they're less capable of catching food, and they tend to not live as long. Now, that's why it's shocking that it's so large, and I would not want to mess with a fish that big. Then, as of 2015, there had been almost 20,000 cases of thyroid cancer reported in people who were exposed at the time of the incident. And approximately 5,000 of these thyroid cancers are likely attributed to them drinking fresh milk containing radioactive iodine from cows that had eaten contaminated grass in the first few weeks following the incident. Yep, you heard that right. The cows created radioactive milk. Now, in 2018, it was said that Ukraine still has radioactivity levels up to 5 times the official safe limit, research suggests. Now, scientists sampled cow's milk from private farms and homes in the Ravine region, about 125 miles away from the site of the catastrophic explosion. Researchers found levels of radioactive caesium in milk above Ukraine's safe limit for adults of 100 becquerel per liter at 6 of 14 settlements studied. Now, the highest levels found were about 500 BQ-liter, 5 times over the limit for adults, and more than 12 times that for the young. The study was carried out at the University of Exeter and the Ukrainian Institute of Agricultural Radiology. More than 30 years after the Chernobyl disaster, people are still routinely exposed to radioactive caesium when consuming locally produced staple foods, including milk, in Chernobyl-affected areas in Ukraine, said Dr. Irina Lembunska of University of Exeter. Though the level of soil contamination in the studied areas is not extremely high, radioactive caesium continues to accumulate in milk and other foods. Now, this is just one of the lasting effects, which is horrific. On a lighter note though, an endangered wild horse is making a comeback thanks to Chernobyl. The Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute called the Przewalski's horses the last truly wild horse. Its once large population that ranged across large areas of Asia and Europe was eventually reduced to almost nothing. When Lee Boyd and Catherine A. Hope edited a book about the animal in 1994, the most recent wild sighting had occurred in the late 60s, leading the authors to declare them extinct in the wild. But British ecologists Mike Wood and Nick Beresford, who specialize in studying the effects of radiation on Chernobyl's wildlife, observed that the Przewalski's horses is thriving within the exclusion zone. In the late 1990s, about 30 of these horses were released in the Ukrainian side of the zone, and the population has increased to more than 200. Based on camera trap images, Wood estimated that some of the original horses, identified by their brand markings, are still alive, and photos of juvenile horses also indicate that the population is expanding. And finally, if you didn't know, Earth has both a magnetic field and an atmosphere that protects us from dangerous radiation. Now, NASA knows that astronauts on the International Space Station get exposed to 20 times the radiation we get down here on the planet. So after discovering that a fungus thriving around the heavily radiated Chernobyl disaster site consumes radiation through radiosynthesis, they decided to experiment with it in space, and over the course of a month they found out that the fungus actually blocks radiation literally by eating it. The experiments on the ISS revealed that it was utilizing melanin to transform radioactive gamma rays into chemical energy. Now, this is actually really exciting because this ability may turn out to be useful in future space exploration. NASA is hoping that the fungus may be used to both shield equipment and the crew from deadly radiation during long space flights, and even more importantly, help clean up radioactive waste. Well, that's all for our list of unsettling creatures found in Chernobyl that won't stop growing. Now, what on our list shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I'm your host, Emily, and we'll see you next time. Peace.